Today I want to share a story that will bring peace. It is the story of Lucas Almeida from Springfield, Ohio, a man whose family was destroyed by a prophecy that never came true. Imagine this. You are 16 years old, and your father comes home and announces that he is going to sell the family home. Why? Because a religious organization convinced him that the world would end in 1975, and it made no sense to plan for a future that would not exist. Lucas was that 16-year-old boy. He watched his father, a respected man in the Jehovah's Witness congregation, make a decision that would terrify the family for decades. They said goodbye to their neighbors, who looked at them with pity and confusion. Lucas left school, convinced that studying was not worth it with the end of the world so close. The family waited and waited and waited for Jehovah to bring about the end of the current system and bless them with the promised paradise. But the end never came. More than 50 years later, Lucas still bears the scars of that illusion: destroyed relationships, missed opportunities, and the silence of a God he was taught to trust without question. This is his story, and the story of thousands of families who lived through one of the most devastating false prophecies in modern religious history. To understand Lucas's story, we need to go back to the 1960s and 1970s, when the Watchtower publications and the Christian Society, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, began to spread what became known as the 1980 doctrine. It was not officially declared as absolute truth, but the message was clear. The end of the world would come in 1975, and the faithful needed to be prepared. The publications featured charts, biblical calculations, and what they called evidence, indicating that 6,000 years of human history would end in 1975, marking the beginning of Christ's millennial reign on earth. Elders visited congregations, giving talks that reinforced this timeline. The message was urgent and non-negotiable. It wasn't just a suggestion, Lucas recalls. It was our future mapped out. They said, "Don't go to college, there's no time. Don't have children. Why bring them into a world that is about to end? Don't save money for retirement. You won't need it. The end is very near." For families like the Almeidas, this was not just a religious doctrine. It was a philosophy of life that guided all decisions. The organization had spoken, and questioning it was seen as a lack of faith, even apostasy. Lucas's father, João Almeida, was what one might call a fervent believer. He was a respected and beloved man in his Springfield congregation. 1975. The message reached its peak in 1978. João made a decision that would forever change his family's life. "I remember the day my father came back from a regional assembly," says Lucas. His eyes had a strange gleam, a mixture of excitement and fear. He called us into the bedroom and announced that we were selling the house. Not because we were moving to something bigger, but because we needed to simplify our lives for the little time we had left in this system. Within a few months, the Almeida family sold their comfortable 4-bedroom house in a quiet middle-class neighborhood. They moved into a small apartment near the Kingdom Hall, using the money from the sale to increase their dedication to religious activities. João quit his job as a supervisor at a local factory and began serving as a pioneer, devoting about 90 hours a month to going door to door with the Watchtower message. Lucas, who was an average student with dreams of perhaps becoming an engineer, dropped out of school at age 16. "Why finish school?" his father replied. "When you could be saving lives by preaching about the paradise that is to come." Lucas's mother, Helena, cried for many nights, but she never voiced her doubts aloud. In the culture of Jehovah's Witnesses, questioning her husband's spiritual decisions was almost the same as questioning Jehovah. The youngest children in the family, Lucas, his 13-year-old sister Clara, and his 9-year-old brother Raphael, did not fully understand what they were missing. They were told that they were the strongest generation, that they would not need to grow up in this evil world. They would go straight from childhood to paradise. Everything in the Almeida family changed at that time. Discussions revolved around what paradise would be like. They studied Watchtower publications, which painted vivid pictures of playing with lions, eating perfect fruit, and reuniting with deceased loved ones. The anticipation was overwhelming, and it made the sacrifices seem justified. 1975 approached. Anxiety among Jehovah's Witnesses congregations around the world reached intense levels. Some families literally stayed on their rooftops, waiting for Armageddon to begin. Others gathered in kingdom halls for special prayer meetings, awaiting divine intervention at any moment. The Almeida family spent September 1980 in a state of constant expectation. "I remember checking the news every day," says Lucas. "We looked for signs, wars, earthquakes, crises, anything that would indicate that Jehovah's day had come. When October arrived and nothing happened, there was a void, a silence heavier than any sound I had ever felt. The silence from the Watchtower organization was deafening. No official statement, no explanation, no apology. Congregation meetings continued as usual, as if nothing had happened. The elders talked about keeping the faith in difficult times, but they never directly addressed the failed prophecy that had impacted so many lives. The world didn't end," says Lucas, his voice still heavy with the pain of that realization decades later. "But our lives did." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. João, who had once been so confident and secure in his spiritual state, became a different person. He stopped actively participating in Watchtower studies. During meetings, he would stare straight ahead, his face frozen in a mask of confusion and silent despair. The man who had sold everything for his faith now seemed to question everything he believed in. The years following 1980 were perhaps even more difficult for the Almeida family than the failed prophecy itself. The Watchtower organization finally acknowledged that there had been excessive enthusiasm and misplaced expectations among some Jehovah's Witnesses, but it never took full responsibility for the doctrine it had promoted. João never fully recovered from the spiritual and emotional crisis. He became increasingly isolated, spending hours reading and rereading Watchtower publications, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. He developed what today could be diagnosed as depression, although mental health issues were rarely discussed in the congregations. Seeking therapeutic help would be seen as a lack of faith in Jehovah's ability to heal all wounds. Helena Almeida's sadness was different, but equally profound. She had seen her family sacrifice their security, their children's education, and their own future for a promise that never materialized. However, in the culture of Jehovah's Witnesses, 1975, women had limited voice in spiritual matters. She could not express her anger or disappointment without being labeled spiritually weak or rebellious. Lucas's younger children perhaps carried the most painful burden. Clara, who had been removed from extracurricular activities and friendships to devote herself exclusively to the truth, had difficulty reconnecting with classmates when she finally returned to school. Raphael, the youngest, lost crucial years of development when play and learning should have been a priority. Instead, he spent hours in kingdom halls and door-to-door work, preparing for a paradise that never came. Many families in the congregation began to quietly leave the organization. Some moved away without explanation. Others simply stopped attending meetings, becoming what witnesses call inactive. But for those who remained, like the Almeidas, speaking openly about disappointment was impossible. Questioning the organization's teachings was considered apostasy, punishable by total severance from faithful family and friends. Lucas, for his part, began to see the flaws in the beliefs he had been raised with. Now, in his 20s, still living with his parents and working in dead-end jobs due to his lack of education, he began to ask dangerous questions. If the organization could be wrong in 1975, what else could be wrong? If they were God's channel of communication, why wouldn't God correct their flaws? When he reached his 20s, Lucas made the painful decision to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses. It was not a choice made lightly. He knew it would cost him his relationship with his family. In witness practice, disfellowshipping and punishment are routine. Faithful members are required to cut off all contact with those who leave. Leaving meant losing everything I knew, Lucas explains. My family, my brothers, my entire social circle, they were all still in the organization. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't sit in meetings and act as if 1980 had never happened, as if we hadn't been deceived. Lucas moved to Chicago, where he worked on construction sites during the day and studied at night at a community college, trying to build the education he had been denied in his youth. It was a difficult and lonely time. He had no friends outside the organization and lacked the social skills to navigate the world that had always been presented to him as dangerous and to be avoided. Meanwhile, his family remained trapped in a cycle of confusion and spiritual denunciation. Jerome, his father, never regained his trust in the organization, but he also never had the courage to leave. He remained a Jehovah's Witness until his death in 2003, a broken man who gave up everything for a promise that was never fulfilled. Helena, his mother, developed severe anxiety and depression in her later years. Although she had periodic doubts about the organization, she was afraid to express them, even to her husband. She passed away in 2018, after more than 40 years of living with the anguish of 1975, without ever feeling free to process that trauma openly. Lucas's siblings followed different paths. Clara finally left the organization in her 30s after her own children began asking questions she couldn't answer, especially about why their grandparents didn't speak to their father. The family reunion between Lucas and Clara, after more than 20 years of forced separation, was an intense experience full of emotions that are difficult to describe. Raphael, the younger brother, remains a Jehovah's Witness to this day. He never married, had no children, and devotes most of his free time to religious activities while working as a lawyer. He maintains that the year 1975 was a true test of faith, and that those who left the organization simply could not withstand this challenge. Raphael has not been in contact with Lucas for over 30 years. Today, Lucas Almeida is 68 years old. He has managed to build a solid life outside the organization that for so long controlled every aspect of his existence. He married an incredible woman who helped him relearn how to trust, raised 2 children who never knew the fear and rigidity of control that marked his own childhood, and even started a small successful business despite the limited education he received. Still, the marks of the past remain. Sometimes, when I calm down at night, I think about who I could have been, he reveals. What if I had finished school? What if I had gone to college? What if my family had never heard about that fateful year? I try not to dwell on these questions, but they are always there. Lucas's story is not unique. Thousands of families were devastated by the failed prophecy of 1975. Many never recovered. Children grew up without a proper education. Families lost their homes and livelihoods. And countless people carried psychological trauma that lasted for decades. Some estimates suggest that more than 1 million Jehovah's Witnesses left the organization in the years following 1975, although exact numbers are difficult to confirm, as the Watchtower Society never publishes statistics on those who leave. What makes Lucas's story especially impactful is the response, or lack thereof, from the organization. The Watchtower Society has never offered a formal apology for 1975 doctrine. It has never acknowledged the families destroyed, nor the lives ruined. In its publications, the organization characterizes the disappointment as the result of individual exaggerations, not flaws in its teachings. They call it misplaced expectations. Lucas says his voice still carries the weight of that betrayal. But we didn't put those expectations on ourselves. They were imposed on us. We were told to trust them as the voice of God on earth. And when the prophecy failed, we were blamed for believing too much. The silence of the leadership was perhaps the most painful aspect of the whole experience. No taking responsibility, no acknowledging the damage caused, and no offering any support to the families whose lives were destroyed by following their advice. 1980 didn't destroy the world, Lucas concludes. It destroyed lives, real people, real families, real futures. And the silence of the leadership? That was the harshest judgment of all. It was like saying that our suffering didn't matter, that our sacrifice meant nothing, and that the organization cared more about protecting its reputation than repairing the damage it had caused. As Lucas's story demonstrates, the real tragedy of a false prophecy lies not only in the disappointment generated by the failure of expectations. It lies in the human cost of decisions made by people who deeply believe in these promises. It lies in the education they never received, the relationships they never built, the dreams they never pursued, all sacrificed for a promise that was never fulfilled. Today, Lucas speaks openly about his experience, hoping that his story will help others facing similar situations. He has learned to find peace despite his losses, to build meaningful relationships despite a difficult start, and to trust his own judgment despite years of being taught not to question authority. But he will never return to those formative years. He will never return to his relationship with his parents. And he will never know what his life would have been like if his family had not believed in a prophecy that destroyed it long before the world came to an end. If you identify with Lucas's story or know someone who is facing similar challenges, please share this video. Your voice may be the support someone needs to find strength and hope. Subscribe to the channel to follow more real stories and deep reflections on faith, hope, and overcoming adversity. Leave your comment below. We want to hear from you and build a community of support and respect. Thank you for watching. May truth and courage always be with you.